Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. First off, let's check in with Rainer and see how he's doing. By the way, I'm Chris Driscoll, and my cohort here is Rainer Shea. So, Rainer, how are you? How you been? What you been up to?
Well, I've decided to stand for these things. It's not comfy to sit for a long time. I've been watching Rick and Morty. I've been watching Dexter.
I love Dexter. He's one of my favorite villains.
We're anti-heroes.
Anti-heroes,
I found out that George Zimmerman was not convicted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. We really need somebody like Dexter to take care of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, who knows what'll happen. Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. Yeah, of course, that's the fantasy world. Here we are in the reality, and in the reality, to start the show off in earnest, on Monday, the United Nations International Panel on Climate Control, Climate Change, I'm sorry, issued its long-awaited report, most recent report. I think the last one was in it was a few years ago, at least. So people have been waiting on this. And what we find from the report, well, first of all, I should preface this with the fact that I only became aware of this today, which is we're doing this late Wednesday evening, the 11th of Wednesday. So by the time we actually put this video up, it'll be Thursday the 12th. So this will be the Thursday, the 12th episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. However, we only know what we know at this moment. And I have not, as I said, yet had a chance to read the IPCC report. So I will be doing that in the coming week or two at the most. And hopefully ready to do something more in depth on this subject later on, because this, from what little I've found out, this IPCC report is a red alert. It's a real wake-up call, hopefully, to the world. So from this article in Reuters says humans are to blame, full stop. And these are the 5 takeaways that Reuters has chosen from the IPCC report. Just a little bit of an explanation on humans are to blame. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change used its strongest terms yet to assert that humans are causing climate change, with the first line of its report summary reading, "It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land." This stark language marked a shift from previous IPCC reports, which had said it was extremely likely that industrial activity was to blame. There is no uncertainty, quote, "there is no uncertainty language in this sentence because there is no uncertainty that global warming is caused by human activity and the burning of fossil fuels," said IPCC co-author Friedrich Otto, a climatologist at the University of Oxford. Number 2, temperatures will keep rising. The report describes possible futures depending on how dramatically the world cuts emissions. But even the severest cuts are likely to unlikely to prevent global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. Without immediate steep emission cuts, though, the average temperatures could cruise past 2 degrees C by the end of the century. Weather is getting extreme, as though we needed to be reminded of this. Weather extremes, once considered rare or unprecedented, are becoming more common, a trend that will continue even if the world limits global warming to 1.5 C. They go through extreme heat waves, we know all the details, wildfires, extreme flooding, extreme hurricanes, and so forth and so on. Arctic summers could soon be free of ice. That is, the whole Arctic ice cap gone. That would be unprecedented. I'll just interject what I know because I've studied this quite a bit myself. Our Arctic ice caps have been with us for at least 2.5 million years and have never gone. We have been in an ice age, and we are still in an ice age for the last little bit less than 2.5 million years. And of course, there are interglacials. There are been about 20 interglacials within that 2.5 million years. And we are living within an interglacial right now. An interglacial is a time when the weather moderates some, and the glaciation retracts back up into the northern reaches of the globe, which has already happened over the last 13,000 years. However, what we're seeing now is unprecedented during this entire 2.5 million ice age. We've never seen a time when the Arctic ice cap just totally disappeared. And that's what they're saying in this, that the Arctic, that by 2050, the Arctic ice caps will melt off during the summer at least once, well, at least 1 year between now and 2050, and likely more than that. So that's a pretty drastic curtailment of the ice age that we're supposed to be living in right now, even if it is the moderating interglacial period. So that's pretty astounding if you think about it. Seas will rise no matter what. Sea levels are sure to keep rising for hundreds or even thousands of years, even if global warming were halted at 1.5 C. The average sea level would still rise about 2 to 3 meters, which is 6 to 10 feet. So imagine your favorite beach out on the Atlantic, Pacific, or Gulf Coast, or Great Lakes for that matter, and the water will be 6 to 10 feet higher by the end of the century, which means a lot more flooding, which means that in most major cities in the United States, which are on one of those coasts, will need to build extensive seawalls of the type that we see in Galveston, Texas, for example, or a few other places. That's the only way to deal with that, other than shutting the whole cities down, which I kind of doubt people are going to do. And finally, running out of time. Meeting the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 1.5 C will require sticking to a carbon budget, a term describing how much additional carbon can be plumbed into the atmosphere before that goal is likely out of reach. Within 2.4 trillion tons of climate warming CO2 added to the atmosphere since the mid 1800s, the average global temperature has risen by 1.1 C already. That leaves 400 billion tons more that can be added before the carbon budget is blown. Global emissions currently total a little more than 40 billion tons a year. And this was just the takeaways, the highlights of the report. Another big thing that CNN had an article on today was methane. Methane, of course, is 20 to 30 times more effective at heat trapping than CO2 is. And methane is right now at the highest point it has been in 800,000 years. So that means during all of the glacial periods, which the regular folks call that an ice age, the glacial periods, but in fact, the ice age is the whole glacial and interglacial and glacial and interglacial cycle over and over again. As long as there's ice caps, you're in an ice age. That's, the way scientists, climate scientists, look at the term ice age. So, I mean, we could, for the first time in almost 2.5 million years, be approaching the end of the ice age, which would mean, much warmer temperatures. Of course, the last, prior to the current ice age that we're living in, temperatures were from like 5 to 10 C higher than they are now, or than they have been in this interglacial period that we are living through, that we have been living through for the last 13.5 thousand years. So there you have it. Rainer will next be launching into a discussion of some of his visions of what this kind of future may bring. So Rainer, what are your thoughts?
Oh, well, remember that short story I wrote or I published a few months ago?
Yes.
That imagined geoengineering scenario. I wonder how likely that kind of thing is. And if that's what happens, where the imperialist governments decide to try to paper over the climate crisis by, say, spraying nitrous oxide, or is that the chemical they plan to use, into the air to create artificial cloud seeding. And there's going to be a whole additional layer of class oppression, national oppression, because that's what this comes down to. This whole climatic crisis, class and national oppression. The oppressor nations, the bourgeoisie, are going to be fine, more likely than not. I don't know exactly how it's going to go, but they're certainly very safe amid this situation. Whereas the Palestinians, the African nation, the indigenous nations, all of these nations that are targeted by imperialism are increasingly under threat from these conditions that are emerging as a consequence of colonialism, as a consequence of colonialism's creation of the US empire. Abby Martin is about to come out with a documentary called Earth's Greatest Enemy that exposes how the US military is the primary culprit for the climate crisis.
Right.
And that's what we need to shift our attention towards: dismantling the US military, taking apart the US empire.
Right.
It's not going to get solved. It's not going to get alleviated sufficiently until the US empire is dismantled. And that's in spite of the fact that China has been greatly picking up the slack relative to the capitalist world when it comes to climate action. China is many years ahead of its Paris Climate Accord goals.
Right.
And this is something that we need to look at. We're going to need to acknowledge if we're going to successfully implement a new socioeconomic system that can sufficiently reduce emissions. China has shown the way. It's it's probably the most successful overall example of climate action, in contrast to US imperialism, which is dragging down the rest of the world in terms of our obligations towards reducing emissions.
Right. Okay, next on the list, climate collapse will create the next wave of colonial genocide. Take it away, Rainer.
This is what I mentioned earlier about how the oppressed nations are going to bear the brunt of the climate crisis. The big parallel between U.S. settler colonialism and Nazism is that their goals are both to grab up as much land as possible for the respective white supremacist nations that they represent. Hitler's Lebensraum, that was his word for this land grab ideology, sought to carve up a bunch of territory for what he called the Aryan nation, so that the Aryan nation could sufficiently develop. And this was motivated by a desire for resources. That was how the Nazis rationalized the genocide of millions of people. They believed that the Jews, the Slavs, the Romas needed to be eradicated in order for the Aryan nation to sufficiently develop. And that's basically the same rationale that US settler colonialism has for waging its ongoing genocide against the African nation and against the indigenous First Nations here. And this ideology of wanting to grab up land, what they see as needing to grab up land in order for the American nation to sufficiently develop, is going to gain even more of a relevance as the climate crisis unfolds. We're in a situation where land itself is becoming increasingly scarce. We're in a situation where ever more of the earth is going to become uninhabitable amid ecological collapse, amid the expansion of deserts, amid the expansion of zones that are simply too hot for human beings to inhabit. And as this increasing scarcity of available land continues, the colonists are going to resort to very drastic measures to keep their place at the top of the social hierarchy. They're going to ramp up militarized police state violence against non-whites. They're going to expand the concentration camps that ICE has, make them more brutal, make them more filled with political dissidents like activists and journalists. They're going to, I think they're going to turn the digital and fence border wall along the US-Mexico border into a wall of bullets, like the one that Israel has along the Gaza border. And I think they're preparing for this now as Biden continues the military occupation along the US border that Trump started. So you see all of these trends towards militarization, towards the Israelification of US law enforcement, with Israelis training US police, towards the greater discrimination in law enforcement, in the US criminal justice system. You see concentration camps being constructed, concentration camps that have been gassing migrants, have been forcibly sterilizing migrants, have been forcing them into deliberately unsanitary conditions without sufficient food or water, conditions where guards regularly abuse them. You see all of these horrors expanding, and you see this environmental crisis unfolding, and the end outcome is obvious unless we stop it.
Exactly. And yeah, I've seen a lot of horror stories being predicted out of this mess. It is extremely likely that at the very least, that there's going to be massive displacement of humanity, no matter what we do at this point, because these people have capitalism kills. And even long after we get rid of capitalism, if and when we do, capitalism will be still killing us for a long, long time. That's the ultimate. So the sooner the better. The sooner a global socialist revolution, the better. Next on the list, calling sanctions by their name. Rania Khalek on US Mideast Genocide. Critics of sanctions argue that they are a blanket breach of international law, which is what I argue as well. And I think the international law is pretty clear on that. And they are a new form of economic warfare. This comes to us from MintPressNews by Mnar Adley. Mnar Adley does MintPressNews's I don't know what you call it, podcast, news show, whatever you want to call it. It's called Mintcast. And she interviewed Rania Khalek for the latest episode of this. We'll have the link to it below this video when it goes up. And she says around 1/4 of the world lives in countries under unilateral United States sanctions. While American government officials insist that sanctions are targeted at officials committing human rights abuses in foreign countries, the United Nations notes that they always disproportionately, this is a quote, disproportionately affect the poor and most vulnerable. In Cuba, US sanctions are causing shortages that led to widespread protest earlier this summer and are slowing the worldwide rollout of Cuba's domestically produced COVID virus vaccine. US sanctions on Venezuela, too, have been widely condemned and are estimated to have caused the deaths of over 100,000 people. It is in the Middle East, however, where US economic measures have arguably had the most impact. In Iraq in the 1990s, US sanctions were thought to have cost the lives of around 1 million people, including 500,000 children under 5 years old. Successive United Nations diplomats tasked with overseeing the sanctions regime resigned in protest, citing a breach of the Genocide Convention. In other words, the United States government's unilateral sanctions are what they call a breach of the Genocide Convention, what I call genocide, pure and simple. One more genocide for the American capitalist class to add to its already astounding numbers of people genocided and culturally cleansed. Rania Khalek was Adley's guest on Mint Press weekly podcast. Khaled is a Lebanese American journalist based in the Middle East. In addition to being a presenter on Breakthrough News, she is a co-host of Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. You may also have seen her work in The Gray Zone, The Intercept, Truth Out, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Al Jazeera, The Nation, Salon, Alternet, or Vice. Khalek spoke about the impact of sanctions across the Middle East and the current political situation in Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Critics of sanctions argue that they are a blatant breach of international law and that they are a new form of economic warfare. One former United Nations special rapporteur described them as akin to a medieval siege. At a time when both countries are trying to recover from the destruction caused by a catastrophic explosion or years of war, Lebanon and Syria's economic situation is being intentionally held back by Washington, Khalek explained on the podcast. As I said, we'll link the Mintcast below this video, so I urge you to watch the whole broadcast because it is much more full of detailed information about Washington's war on the rest of the world, economic war that they execute through sanctions. Rainer?
You know, I get the sense that the only reason why the US still has the ability to wage this kind of economic warfare is because US imperialism continues to economically dominate the globe. And as we've discussed, US financial dominance has been declining in recent years relative to the previous decades overall. And both US and Chinese economists have been recently predicting that the US dollar is soon going to drop in value like it's never dropped before. I wonder if the potency of US economic sanctions is going to decline after this imminent collapse.
Well, it will certainly decline because that's a big part of it. What will really make it decline, or would really make it decline more than anything else, would be if large parts of the rest of the world began to use another international currency and trade system other than the dollar. That is the bottom line there. And the fact that the American empire has 800 plus military bases, plus another, 200-300 CIA and NSA and so forth bases around the world. That is more military garrisons than any other empire in the history of humankind has ever had, by a long shot. The Romans had about 30 garrisons throughout their empire, to give you a comparison. The Chinese have one military garrison outside of China. The Russian Federation has 10. 2 of those are in Syria, which is Russia's closest Arab ally. And the other 8 are in other Commonwealth of Independent States countries, meaning that, obviously they are basically remnants of the Soviet Union. They are bases that have been there for decades and decades and decades, long before the Russian Federation became a country at the end of 1991. So, basically Russia sticks to its own union, because that's basically the way the Commonwealth of Independent States is supposed to operate, as an economic and political union of former Soviet republics. And almost all the former Soviet republics are members of the CIS voluntarily. They do it because they see the logic in sticking together, at least economically and also politically, and in a lot of ways militarily. So that Russia's 10, Iran has none, none of these countries. Venezuela has no garrisons outside of Venezuela. The 2 countries in the world today that have significant garrisons outside their own country are the United States with about 1,000 and the UK with about 30. So the UK is rivaling the Roman Empire. But the United States far outstrips that, and far outstrips any empire that preceded it by magnitudes. So, yeah, that is a big, hurdle to overcome in countries shaking the murderous, terroristic aspects of these illegal acts of war that the United States calls sanctions, that are unilateral, and under the UN Charter, unilateral sanctions by a single state are illegal unless they are as part of a declared war. And as we all know, the United States has not been in a declared war since World War II. Every war that the United States has started against other people, more than 60 of them at least, has been an undeclared war, which makes the war illegal. And sanctions that have gone on along with it are illegal because they're unilateral usually. Only the UN can impose sanctions, and the UN is very hesitant about this because so many people in the UN bureaucracy see the downside as very detrimental and don't see it as a very effective tool for diplomacy. So anyway, anything more on that?
No.
Okay, next on the list is Bolivia's coup defeat foreshadows defeat of US empire, August 10th, 2021. And this once again comes to us from RainerShay.com.
There was a plot last year by Bolivian officials, officials within the illegitimate coup government, to carry out a second coup, where they were planning to overturn the results of the election last fall in Bolivia, where Luis Arce, the socialist, won, and install a new candidate. And they plan to do this by importing US mercenaries that were supposed to infiltrate the country by wearing plain clothes before overturning the election violently. But when the election happened, this had to be abandoned because the coupists didn't anticipate the margin with which Arce won. They were stuck in their fantasies of still having a huge amount of popular support for their Zionist, pro-imperialist, anti-environmental, anti-worker, racist agenda. And this really reflects the hubris that the imperialists have in general. They can't face the fact that they're divorced from the masses. And this is leading to failures like the one in Bolivia, failures like the one in Peru recently, where the far-right candidate Fujimori, the imperialist-backed candidate, has tried to carry out a coup against the victorious socialist Pedro Castillo, but has failed due to the popular support, the undeniable legitimacy of Castillo's victory. And this kind of trend is going to keep popping up more and more across the global south, and eventually the core imperialist countries as US imperialism declines. It's not going to be as peaceful throughout the rest of the global south and within the core imperialist countries, that the transition towards anti-imperialist governance isn't going to happen as easily as this. But in the end, the imperialists are going to lose because they're divorced from the masses.
Exactly. Good points. Good points. I'm not going to belabor this too much more, but I agree with you 100%. Next on the list, struggle makes the difference. On an on the ground account of Cori Bush-led sit-in by Benjamin Zinevich and Michael Bearman in Liberation, which is the newspaper of the Party of Socialism and Liberation. Let me scroll down here a bit, get to where I'm at. So according to Liberation, on July 30, Representative Cori Bush announced the start of a sit-in on the steps of the Capitol building in outraged response to the federal government's failure to act to stop the wave of evictions that threatened millions across the country. Inspired by Representative Bush's action, hundreds of predominantly young activists joined the sit-in, determined to spend all day and night at the Capitol until the nationwide eviction moratorium was reinstated. This action led to a major victory on August 3rd. The Biden administration, it's their word, not mine, by means of the Centers for Disease Control, announced that the federal moratorium on evictions would be extended for 60 days in parts of the country with high rates of COVID-19 spread, an area that includes the vast majority of the US population. The moratorium policy has kept around 10 million people legally protected from eviction. Now, here at RSR, we reported on this action led by Representative Cori Bush last week, at which time we noted that the action began after Congress had gone for its summer recess, which takes up the entire month of August, meaning that Congress was not likely to do anything about it. And of course, Congress has not returned and not done anything about it. The Bush regime did issue an executive order directing the CDC to extend the moratorium by 60 days, 2 months. However, the extension has already been challenged in court in a suit claiming that the president, and I would add claiming with some pretty good evidence, claiming that the president does not have the power to issue such an order without congressional legislation. You see, the one thing that Congress has always had under its purview is the authorization of spending money. And of course, obviously, this is going to take spending money just to implement this order. Yeah, I mean, under US law, no matter how much illegal power presidents have accrued, especially since 2000, since the Second World War, which is enormous. I mean, presidents have accrued dictatorial powers upon themselves since the Second World War, to the point where the presidency is commonly called the imperial presidency, which is the perfect word for it. I just shorten that to emperor, because that's what these presidents really have become. They become emperors. But even with all that, under US law, Congress still holds the purse strings. So it's unlikely that this CDC extension of the moratorium by 60 days is going to make it through the court challenges. Rainer?
Yeah, this is part of the importing of the conditions of the global South into the core of global imperialism, the United States. In Colombia, for instance, millions of people have become displaced by the hyper-exploitation that's been occurring. Did I say Bolivia? I mean Colombia. In Colombia, millions have been displaced, have essentially become refugees due to the impoverishment that hyper-exploitation has brought upon them. And the worse this has gotten, the more inclined the masses there have become to embrace the option of revolutionary armed struggle. in response to the mass displacement and environmental degradation and increasing impoverishment of the last 4 years. Former FARC members, the FARC is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, they've formed a new guerrilla army. I think it might be pronounced Segunda Marquiela. I doubt I'm pronouncing that right. That's been gaining steadily new members, if gradually gaining new members, and they've gained the consent of the masses that they hold jurisdiction over. So they've shown the route towards defeating this kind of hyper exploitation, this kind of engineered poverty. The route is the same type of revolutionary armed struggle with the help of national strikes, of course, that has brought about revolutions from Russia to Cuba.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. This is, basically an extension of something that we've been talking about for a long time here on RSR. Anyway, next point. Latin American terror and the looming US bloodshed campaign, August 6, 2021, from RainerShay.com. Take it away, Rainer.
There's so many parallels between the January 6th Capitol Hill riot and the 2019 US facilitated Bolivia coup. During the Capitol Hill riot, many of the participants who had evidently had military training, they went into a neat file, each of them with their hands over the collars of the person in front of them, and they marched just like how a military formation would march. There's some obvious parallels between this and the marches of militarily trained individuals throughout Bolivia during the coup process, where democratically elected indigenous socialist president Evo Morales was forcibly ousted due to false allegations of fraud by the Organization of American States. Basically, Trump imported the Latin American coup strategy into his haphazard attempt to retain power in the face of his loss of legitimacy. And this is a trial run for the kinds of militarized crackdowns that are going to increasingly take place within the US. Crackdowns that parallel not just coups like the one in Bolivia, but state terror campaigns like the one in Colombia. Colombian police, Colombian military, Colombian state-backed paramilitaries have been carrying out numerous human rights abuses against the opponents of the Colombian far right for decades, and they've been ramping it up this year as anti-austerity protests have exploded within the country. And the U.S. is going to import these kinds of policing tactics, and by that I mean make the police human rights abuses that are already obviously very normal within the United States more extreme. They're going to make U.S. police just as untethered from constraints as the Colombian police are. And they're going to deputize the members of far-right militias like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters so that they can join in on the carnage. The people targeted, just like in Colombia and Bolivia and elsewhere, will be communists, indigenous people, Black people, LGBT people, human rights activists, journalists, and everyone else that the empire deems a threat.
Yeah, we're already seeing big indications of this going on with the treatment of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. I was reading an article today from the New Times newspaper here in Phoenix, which it started out as what they called back in the day an alternative newspaper, but it's basically just kind of a tabloid newspaper now. And it was about last year, after late last year, I think it was in October, 15 activists, BLM activists, were arrested and charged in Maricopa County under anti-gang laws, and basically charged with aiding and abetting armed violent gangs. So, you know, which was obviously utterly ridiculous. The charges ended up being dropped after the mayor, who's a Democrat, came under tremendous pressure from the Black community and from, you know, the entire community, I think. But it had only come up again now because the woman who was in the Maricopa County DA's office, who prosecuted and brought these charges of abetting gang violence, is now suing the Maricopa County DA's office for basically for using her as a scapegoat. It's really astounding. I don't think she'll get anywhere with this lawsuit, but you know, it's just one more example of, you know, the absurdity of all this stuff. I mean, we saw the black bagging of protesters in the last year. We saw the arresting of anti-police state protesters and charging them with kidnapping. You'll remember that one from Denver with the PSL, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, the 4 activists there, who, by the way, the charges against them have all been dropped now, from what I read this week. So, you know, hopefully they will countersue, because in my opinion, you know, this kind of harassment, it is a gross violation of the law. It is a gross misuse of power as it is, and it shouldn't stand. The people who are criminally negligent in this regard, the prosecutors, judges, police, they should all serve time in jail for these kinds of crimes against the people, in my opinion. But yeah, it's only going to get worse, as you say, Rainer, and it's going to get a lot worse, and it's going to continue to get worse until we, the American working class, and all of our allies stand up and put a stop to it, because we have more power in our hands than all their hoarded gold, as this old song goes. Finally, today's elevated anti-communism by those on the right and the left is rooted in the century-old global socialist split. It is still molding and thwarting working class struggles. Now, this point, this last topic, comes basically from several articles actually, and I will put links to all of them under under the video when we post it. But communism is a failed system. Quote, this is a quote. Communism is a failed system, universally failed system, and I don't see socialism as a very useful substitute. But that's another story, said Joe Biden in late July. And he was responding or talking about the protests in Cuba, the counter-revolutionary, often terroristic, paid for by the US AID, the NED, and CIA directed these protests. They're obviously just one more failed attempt at really pathetic, poor attempt at regime change in Cuba. To a liberal capitalist politician like pedophile Joe, any example of working people running our own societies for our own benefits is socialism or communism, which is true. And he also adds, must be crushed at any cost. This latest hate speech by pedophile Joe against the working class came in the aftermath of the American empire's most recent failure at regime change in Cuba, as I said, in which violent protesters were paid by the CIA, NED, USAID. They caused civil unrest for a few weeks. These terrorist activities were soon quelled by the Cuban people themselves, who came out in the streets by the hundreds of thousands in counter protests. According to New Yorker magazine, amid mass protests in Cuba, socialist magazine Jacobin is defending the regime with anti-communist polemics, as is whoever is running the Black Lives Matter messaging on the issue. Democratic Socialists of America is posting messages backing the regime. When the official DSA account stated that the group's ideology leaves behind authoritarian visions of socialism in the dustbin of history, the tweet generated internal backlash and subsequently got deleted. Again, that's from New Yorker magazine. The Cuba debate is really about communism. Communism has split the American left for generations, and since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the schism has evolved into a broader schism over left-wing authoritarianism and the centrality of liberal democracy, wrote the New Yorker. But has communism really split the American left for generations? And is this really a fight within the socialist and communist left between left-wing authoritarianism and the centrality of liberal democracy? Or is it something much more deeply rooted in the century-long split between social democrats and communists? An ideological cleavage that for the decade after the Soviet Revolution tore into practically every socialist, social democratic, and labor party in the world. In fact, the split was caused by a minority bureaucratic right wing in the socialist parties that maneuvered to deny the great majority, who were communists, access to the organizations, forcing us out of the socialist, social democratic, and labor parties. We were the ones forced out. And these people the reason these right-wing bureaucrats in these organizations, the estimates for the United States, for example, are that they represented only about 1/3 of the Socialist Party members, but they knew that if they allowed the next Congress convention of the Socialist Party of America to happen, that the great majority, 2/3, would vote in a communist leadership in the Socialist Party. So instead of allowing that, this minority of about 1/3 blocked access to the communists, didn't even allow them into the hall when the convention was meeting, banned them. So in other words, outright banned 2/3 of the membership from sending their delegates to the convention. So that's the way it happened here, and it was very similar in most other countries around the world that had socialist parties, which was at least 60 to 70%. 60 to 70 countries around the world by that point. And in all cases, almost all cases, those parties split into socialist parties or social democratic parties and communist parties. In a couple of cases, the socialist parties were actually captured by the communists, and they went on basically to operate, to join the Communist International and become part of the communist global movement. Because
yes, I'm planning to say something about the CPUSA after you're done.
Okay, well, I got a ways to go here. Bear with me. Because the communist movement was precipitated by the anti-war faction during World War II and the Soviet Revolution, the minority right-wing reformist factions simply kept the memberships from voting in new leaderships. That would have reflected the majority will. So it was the reformists, not the communists, who have split the American left for generations, to paraphrase the New Yorker magazine. And although Jacobin magazine and the DSA seem to be split on the subject as well, those organizations are still as likely as not to side with CIA, State Department, and anti-communist, pro-imperialist talking points. And their ties to the Democrat Party are at the root of that anti-communism and pro-imperialism. An article published August 9th in the Greenville Post titled "Targeting Cuba and China, Disinformation Against Communism" says, one of the filters in the propaganda model propounded by professors Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky was stoking a fear of communism. The establishment's anti-communism has never abated in the United States. The elitists require a populace fearful of communism to protect their own misbegotten wealth accumulation. Thus, the bugaboo of communism must be opposed wherever it arises. At its worst, the US would wage war against communist countries such as North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Yugoslavia. When not militarily attacked, communist governments were demonized by, and still are, demonized by a relentless campaign of disinformation designed to bring about the fall of the government and its replacement by a government amiable to the US establishment, as happened in the Soviet Union. That is the nature of imperialism and the predatory capitalism, according to the Greenville Post. According to Wikipedia, differences between revolutionary and reformist wings of the workers' movement had been increasing for decades, but the outbreak of World War I was the catalyst for their separation. The Triple Alliance comprised two empires, while the Triple Entente was formed by three. Socialists had historically been anti-war and internationalists, fighting against what they perceived as militarist exploitation of the proletariat for bourgeois states. A majority of socialists voted in favor of resolutions for the Second International to call upon the international working class to resist war if it were declared. And then the wiki article goes on. But after the beginning of World War I, many European socialist parties announced support for the war effort of their respective nations. Exceptions were the British Labour Party, the Socialist Party of the Balkans. To Vladimir Lenin's surprise, even the Social Democratic Party of Germany voted in favor of the war. After influential anti-war French socialist Jean Jaurès was assassinated on 31 July 1914, the Socialist parties hardened their support in France for their government of national unity and for the war. Socialist parties in neutral countries mostly supported neutrality rather than totally opposing the war. On the other hand, during the 1915 Zimmerwald Conference, Lenin, then a Swiss resident refugee, organized an opposition to the imperialist war as the Zimmerwald Left, publishing the pamphlet Socialism and War, where he called socialists collaborating with their national governments social chauvinists, i.e. socialists in word, but nationalists in deed. The Second International divided into a revolutionary wing, a moderate center wing, and a more reformist right wing. Lenin condemned much of the center as social pacifists for several reasons, including their vote for war credits, despite publicly opposing the war. Lenin's term social pacifist aimed at, in particular, at Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the Independent Labour Party in Britain, who opposed the war on grounds of pacifism, but did not actively fight against it. Discredited by its apathy towards the world events, the Second International dissolved in 1916. In 1917, after the February Revolution overthrew the Romanov dynasty, Lenin published the April Theses, which openly supported revolutionary defeatism, where the Bolsheviks hoped that Russia would lose the war so that it could quickly cause a socialist insurrection. The victory of the Russian Communist Party in the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917 was felt throughout the world, and an alternative path to power to the parliamentary politics was demonstrated. With much of Europe on the verge of economic and political collapse in the aftermath of the carnage of World War I, the revolutionary sentiments were widespread. The Russian Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, believed that unless socialist revolution swept Europe, they would be crushed by the military might of world capitalism, just as the Paris Commune had been crushed by force of arms in 1871. The Bolsheviks believed that this required a new international to foment revolution in Europe and around the world. In January 1919, Vladimir Lenin invited the IWW and radical wing of the Socialist Party of America to join the founding Communist Third International, the Comintern. The left-wing section of the Socialist Party emerged as an organized faction early that same year, building its organization around a lengthy left-wing manifesto authored by Louis Freina. This effort to organize in order to win the Socialist Party for the left wing met with staunch resistance, from the regulars who controlled the big majority of the seats in the Socialist Party's NEC. When it seemed certain that the 1919 party elections for a new NEC had been dominated by the left wing, the sitting NEC, citing voting irregularities, refused to tally votes, declared the entire election invalid, and in May 1919 suspended the party's Russian, Latvian, Ukrainian, Polish, South Slavic, and Hungarian language federations, in addition to the entire state organization of Michigan. In future weeks, state organizations of Massachusetts and Ohio would similarly be disenfranchised and reorganized by the NEC, while in New York and Pennsylvania, the regular state executive committee undertook reorganization of left-wing branches and locals on a case-by-case basis. That was all from the wiki article titled Socialist Party of America, Split of the Left Wing section. Since the beginning of World War I, and especially since the Socialist-Communist split, the founding of the Communist International at its first Congress in Moscow on the 2nd through the 6th of March 1919, reformist socialists have gravitated towards liberals and liberalism, adopting the liberal pro-imperialist, anti-labor policies of American, Anglosphere, European, and Japanese imperialism. Capitalist anti-communism is a linchpin of liberal capitalist imperialism. Liberal capitalism, of course, always sides with the capitalist, with capital against labor, and on the international scale, it sides with imperialism against the mass movements of the working class, which are always socialist or communist, those being the two favorite ideologies of the working people around the world, just as liberalism, conservatism, and fascism are the favorite ideologies of the capitalist class. So when self-identified socialists such as anarchist Noam Chomsky and DSA members like AOC and her squad and Bernie Sheepdog Sanders side with the CIA, State Department, and Pentagon against socialist or anti-imperialist countries, they are acting according to long-established modus operandi. And it always comes at the expense of one or another working class government, state, party, strike, or liberation movement. So what's to be done? Social democratic organizations like the DSA will always attract reformists and attempt to convince them, the working class, that reformist ideas like accommodating capitalist rule and supporting imperialism are good for workers. In fact, reformism is always harmful to worker interests. However, our recent guest, Gabriel Rockhill, pointed out a few weeks back, reformist organizations also attract workers ripe for revolutionary action and thought, and even attract committed revolutionary socialists. So how should communists and revolutionary socialists reach out to these people and at the same time level an effective critique at the reformist leaders of these organizations? For that matter, how should we approach the working class as a whole? The answer lies in coalition work that is working side by side with these people, not in reformist organizations, but in single issue coalitions against wars, for social justice, for universal health care, against neoliberalism and the police state, and for labor. In fact, one of the most effective ways of fighting anti-communism is standing against imperialist wars. The natural constituency for such coalitions is large, including unions, other working class organizations, peace groups, and even environmental groups. Following up on something that Rainer mentioned earlier, according to a Brown University report published June 12th, 2019, the DoD is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum and correspondingly the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. According to the Brown Report, the American empire's wars since 2001 began. Since the 2001 beginning of the war on the Afghan people, have produced 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases. War produces massive amounts of human-caused global warming, more than any, even the largest industrial countries do. So, Rainer, thoughts?
You know, I've been studying the CPUSA, Communist Party USA, lately, trying to find out their position, and apparently they've been at least veering more towards revolutionary socialism, as opposed to their reputation of reformism. And part of this is because they've, as an organization, rejected the claim from one columnist in their adjacent publication People's World that China is committing a genocide against the Uyghurs. That's a big part of this current push towards reformism among these revisionist so-called socialists in the West. This belief that the PRC is carrying out massive human rights abuses within Xinjiang, when that couldn't be further from the truth. Same goes for the human rights abuse claims about the DPRK and about Cuba. Also Venezuela, Vietnam, the USSR, any other given socialist country, but right now China is their main target. And that's the big decider right now as to whether or not an organization is revisionist. You need to find out whether or not they think that the Uyghur genocide is real. If they think it's real, they're revisionist.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That makes good sense. Okay, that wraps it up for tonight, unless you have anything to add, Rainer?
Well, I think I weirded you out at the beginning of last week's show when I mentioned a recent news story about someone named Christine Weston Chandler, who was arrested for incest. And that didn't have anything to do with anything at the time, but in this last week, that case has gained political relevance because Tucker Carlson covered this this individual, and he has tried to use it as an ideological weapon against the transgender rights movement, because Christine is trans. So the right is making this into a whole new culture war wedge issue, like cancel culture or critical race theory. It's a pretty wild story that the internet has been freaking out about these last few weeks since it broke, and now it's been propelled into the political mainstream. I feel like Chris Chan is another symptom of U.S. imperial decline.
Well, yeah, I guess you didn't really give it a lot of context, like going much into who this person was and what her significance was and what did she say, what's her stands on issues and so forth, and what was the real charge of incest. I mean, incest with whom? Was it two So it was two consenting adults.
Not consenting. Definitely not.
How's it not consenting? I mean, she
the
raped her mother?
Because the mother had dementia. But
Okay. So
yeah,
yeah, I mean that's not fair game to have sex with a person with dementia who isn't going to be even remember the the shit, an hour later. Uh in any case, yeah, I was not weirded out. I was just kind of nonplussed trying to place it all, and I figured I'll see more about it. I mean, there's lots of things that go on with your younger generation that is outside my uh, prior experience, I guess you could say. So it takes me a while to figure it out. But yeah, I have yet to see anything besides what you're telling me about this whole thing. So, um, you know, part of the problem there is the funnelization of the internet by uh, Facebook, basically. So if spend most of your time on the internet, here's what I do. I spend about half of my time on the internet looking through Facebook posts that I get, and about half my time looking at the publications of the left and a few right wing and other, smattering of other sources. Um, so I guess in those venues where I get my stuff from, this is not an issue. It certainly has, as you say, it's become an issue with Carl with Carlson. What's his name? Tucker Carlson. Yeah, I really enjoyed Tucker Carlson. I think he's an entertaining character, and I can see why he has had a show for so many years. First of all on MSNBC, and then on I think he's on Fox now, right? Last couple of years. Yeah. But I mean, he was like a fixture on MSNBC for a couple of decades, but he was like their token right winger, and sometimes he actually does take good positions. Sometimes he has anti-war positions. But overwhelmingly, he takes positions that are abhorrent to any decent human being. But yeah, I mean, he is an entertaining guy. And it's not surprising at all that somebody like him is trying to, take the place of Rush Limbaugh or somebody like that is going to jump on this kind of thing and run with it. Although, I think maybe Tucker doesn't understand his older audience either, because to his older audience, I think people are just going to look kind of confused, just like I did last week, and say, what's this got to do with anything? This isn't politics. What's this all about? So, well, I mean, she's been arrested. Okay. She committed a crime. She's been arrested. All right. Move on. Yeah. That's the way I guess I mean, I remember a very close dear friend of mine who died in the early 90s, who was the founder of the Labor Party. His name was Tony Mazzocchi. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was also the Treasury Secretary of the Oil, Atomic, and Chemical Workers Union, which is now a part of the Steel Workers Union in Pittsburgh. I mean, not in Pittsburgh, but they're headquartered in Pittsburgh. The International Steelworkers, the Steelworkers Union, International Steelworkers Union. What are they called? I can't even remember their official name, but they call it international because it's the steelworkers operate in both Canada and the United States, so therefore, sort of international. And Tony, I remember him saying at one point, he says, I just can't get into gonad politics, and I thought, yeah, that's a good way to put it, Tony. Gonad politics. It's like, so fucking what? I don't give a fuck about your sexcapades. I don't give a fuck about your sexual this, that, your sexual gossip, whatnot, if it's against the law, and somebody catches her, in this case, she's a her, right? Or she's a trans, but yeah, she's a her. Okay, just want to get the pronoun correctly. She's been arrested there. I mean, what is she, anything to the left?
No.
Like, to the real left, the Marxist Leninist left, she's nothing, right?
No, it's just an interesting facet of our political rhetoric that's emerged.
So it's no stain on us. That I might be concerned with, if she was a stain on us for some way or another, which that occasionally can happen because we've got, our, I mean, there are perverts in the left, just like anywhere else, So, I mean, people who, and I'm pretty, libertarian when it comes to sexual matters, but when it comes to raping a dementia victim, that I'd say that I draw the line there, definitely. Raping anybody, I draw the line, obviously. Rape is not, it's not, rape is not something that should be tolerated anywhere, anytime. And I mean, obviously that sounds trite because pretty much everyone who's not a pervert or not a rapist believes that. So anyway, with that, good that you brought that up and cleared that up, Rainer. And with that, I'd say this brings us to an end. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So until next week, thank you, Rainer, for your great contributions. Thanks to all of our audience members, listeners, and viewers. And please join us again next week. And until then, as Shakespeare said, I bid you a sweet adieu.